You have just been notified of new DNA matches. Could this be the match that finally breaks down your genealogy brick wall? But hold on, not so fast. Your match is good, but there's no family tree associated with it. Now what? In this video, DNA expert Mary Eberle of DNA Hunters will be showing you how to build out the family trees for your DNA matches. If we haven't met before, I'm Lisa, genealogy researcher and author, and this YouTube channel is dedicated to helping you find your ancestors, grow your family tree, and not get overwhelmed in the process. Sound like your cup of tea? Then let's get started. Now, Mary Eberle is a genealogy researcher and DNA expert. She is all about helping families solve family history mysteries using DNA as part of that process. So let's listen in on a conversation that Mary and I recently had on how to build those family trees out for DNA matches when there is no family tree associated with it.
So let's start out with an example from Ancestry. And this person, Mr. Bees, he actually had his full name, but he did not have a tree. And he's a pretty strong match. He looks like he's second to third cousin. And when I looked at his shared matches, I could tell that he's related to me through the Psalms. So Psalm, S-A-L-M, just like the Bible with the P-S-A-L-M. That's my mom's maiden name. So I knew that he was likely to be a second to third cousin through the Psalm family. And that told me that I should build out his tree to his great-grandparents, since second cousins share great-grandparents, or maybe to the second great-grandparents, in case he's a third cousin. One of the tools that I really like for doing this detective work and tree building is Ben Verified. And it's a paid service. They charge twice a year. It's about $60 every time, so about $120 per year. There are some free services too that you can do. I think Ben Verified, somebody pointed out to me recently, has a trial where you can just test it out. But there are other services too, like this. But I go to Ben Verified and I put in his name, and it came up with a couple of different ones with that first name and the second name. They were about 30 years different in age, and I looked at the known cities, and I know where the Psalms come from. In general, I would say the 87-year-old person looks more likely to be the right guy. He's from New Holstein, Wisconsin. And but I can't rule out the other 57-year-old because Kaukauna, Wisconsin is near New Holstein, and I could easily figure out how one of my Psalm cousins would end up in Kaukauna. So I think there were more people with this name, but these two seem the most likely. So then the question is, well, how do I figure out, is it number one or number two? And for this question, I ran a Google search just with his name plus that Psalm surname. And that gave me a couple of hits to different obituaries where a Psalm had married a Bees. And I've highlighted those with the red arrows. We've got a couple different people. And the one on the bottom had his name. So his name meaning, instead of Mr., his first name. So from this, I built a tree for him, and I built it back to some ancestors that I recognized. And these are his great-grandparents, and they're my second great-grandparents. So he is my second cousin once removed. And it's consistent with what the DNA was telling me, that he's likely my second to third cousin. And it's consistent with what I thought I should do in terms of building his tree. that I needed to build it to the great-grandparents or to his second great-grandparents. So that was a really nice, pretty straightforward example from Ancestry, where now I know he's a Psalm cousin. I can label him as such with those colored dots in Ancestry. And I have built this tree, which ultimately it's connected to mine, since Nicholas Psalm and Maria Wagner are my second great grandparents. And when I'm doing this tree building, I'm doing it inside of Ancestry. And I do it inside my Eberle family tree. And I'm hoping that I can connect these people up to my known ancestors. So that is my Ancestry example, and also a good example of how Google served up who he likely was, and I was able to build his tree. This is a MyHeritage example, and her name was Patricia, and then a Polish surname that I didn't recognize. She did have a tree. So it says she appears in a family tree on MyHeritage with 37 people, and that she's the manager of it. She's a relatively distant cousin, maybe a third or fourth cousin, only sharing 35.8 centimorgans. But this looked interesting, and I wanted to know who she was. So I pulled up her tree on MyHeritage, and that told me that that Polish surname was her married name. And because I could see who her father and mother were, because they were deceased, then I knew her maiden name. And from that, I recognized her. And she was somebody that I matched on Ancestry. And I had actually built a tree for her over on Ancestry. She's this red arrow person. And these people, all the people with the DNA pictures, are my DNA matches, and I'm connecting them back to these ancestors. And interestingly, this is not part of my known family tree, but I believe that this is part of my mystery, where I'm looking for my second great grandfather. And what this really helped me with was that once I recognized who she was, and I had built a tree for her, I knew that she would be important on MyHeritage, because any of her shared matches there could also help me with this mystery. So it was a way of identifying someone over at MyHeritage who can help, just through the shared matches. And it also helped because MyHeritage gives you that segment data, and I'm doing some tracking of that segment data for this mystery. So that's my MyHeritage example. Here's an example from 23andMe. This is from an unknown father case. So I had a client and her mother who was living. So actually the mom was the client, but her mother was in her 80s, and I worked with the daughter to figure out this mystery. And she had an unknown father. She had a birth certificate from Minnesota, but they could never figure out who the father was. They had a name, but the name just didn't ever connect with anyone. So I checked her matches over on 23andMe, and this match, whose initials were SD, came up as a likely second to third cousin. And 23andMe shows you where you're matching the DNA with your match. but I was trying to figure out, well, who is this person? Because 23andMe, most people on 23andMe do not have family trees. That's very, like I would say 99% of the time there aren't any family trees. So I looked at our shared matches. On 23andMe, they're called relatives in common. I apologize, that relatives word got cut off. But relatives in common. And I saw that her two sons had done DNA testing. So this is SD versus the client, and then the two sons. And it's telling me that for the client, these sons look like second cousins twice removed, and that, of course, they were SD's son, or sons. And they had their full names, so I knew I could pretty easily figure out what I could about these people. And one of the sons, the one MD son, he had run for political office. And on Facebook, he had a page for his campaign. And I reached out to him on Facebook and just said, hey, I'm helping this woman in her 80s look for her birth father. And it looks like you and your mom and your brother are DNA matches to her. And I'm just trying to figure out how you're connected. And he told me that they had done DNA testing because his mom had an unknown father. So, at that point, you always think, oh my gosh, I hope my client's related to her through her mother's side. And the mother, SD, her maiden name was Scottish. So I had her married name, which is why the D is the same between her and her sons. And just that background about the unknown father, I was able to find her marriage record. So I got to her maiden name through that. And here's the tree I built for her. So we've got her, her mom, and then her mother's mother is a Schaefer, and then her mother's mother is this person, who was a Macaulay. And that was really helpful because her Macaulays were from Nova Scotia. And over on Ancestry, I had a group of matches who were also Macaulays from Nova Scotia. And the downside to this was that I couldn't figure out how these two sets of Macaulays were related. But the upside was that I could use this SD to fish out other Macaulays over on 23andMe.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So that was really helpful. And in the end, I did find the birth father. It was a man who had moved at a very young age from Canada into Minnesota. And the pregnancy was with like 15 or 16-year-olds. And, it was totally consistent with the story, which was that her mother's mother ran this young man out of town. And the name was really close to the name on the birth certificate, but there were spelling differences. So that's why the client couldn't ever track down the man on the birth certificate, is because the grandma who probably helped fill out this birth certificate didn't quite have the name right, didn't have the spelling right.
Got it.
So, those examples are are instances where I could figure out who the match was, who they're, I could build out a tree for them.
Mhm.
And I do have a full version of this talk over at Legacy Family Tree Webinars. And it's called the same thing. It's called Building Family Trees for Your DNA Matches. And I wanted to share that with your audience in case they are members over at Legacy, because it's in the library and you can search for it either with the title or with my surname. And there's also a handout that goes along with this talk that I prepared for Legacy, but you can get it at dnahunters.com/building trees.
I hope you found that helpful. I know that I personally learned some really good tips to put to use in my own genealogy research. Now, if you would like to see Mary do more DNA videos here on the Are You My Cousin channel, be sure and hit the like button, and that'll let me know that you want to see more of her videos.